Hello and welcome to the Federal. You're watching our program Off the Beaten Track, and I'm your host for this one, Nilanjan Mukhopadhyay. Vinayak Damodar Savarkar becomes a subject of controversy in Indian politics every few months. Issues which caused the outburst, however, remain the same. Was he actually a brave nationalist who could be called Veer or brave? Did he really write mercy petitions to the British government? Did Gandhi advise Savarkar to write the plea he sent in 1920? Was Savarkar's legacy neglected by previous government, that is prior to 2014? Was he involved in the conspiracy to murder Mahatma Gandhi? There are many more questions besides these. These questions, however, scratch the surface of the complexity surrounding an extremely controversial personality. I am going to speak to Vinayak Chaturvedi on Savarkar. He is a professor of history in the University of California, Irvine. But more importantly, he is the author of the excellent and an important book, Hindutva and Violence, which provides a completely new way of looking into the world and the mind of Savarkar. Welcome to the program, Professor Vinayak Chaturvedi, and I'm extremely thankful for you to spare time and joining us on this program.
Well, great. Thank you very much for having me.
I would like to start with you with a very contemporary question. Did the Congress leader Rahul Gandhi miss a trick by raking up the issue of Savarkar's mercy petitions, and that too while being in Maharashtra?
So my interpretation of this debate, and actually debate is probably not the right word, of these issues that keep coming up, as you point out, whether he begged, whether he asked for mercy. I find these to be actually quite misguided in many ways. I mean, I think the criticism of Savarkar, there are many criticisms of Savarkar that we can make, and I think there are very many legitimate criticisms that we can make. And he writes in a huge amount in his career, which unfortunately very few people end up reading, whether his critics or his supporters. So, I mean, I would like to begin with that point. But I think if you look at letter writing it's from the late 18th century, whether you look at figures in American history, whether it's George Washington, or you look at 19th century figures like Karl Marx, or a figure like Savarkar himself, I mean, what you see is that the valedictions in these letters follow a specific pattern. The issue of the use of the word beg, identifying oneself as an obedient servant, was actually a normative practice for letter writing from the late 18th century through the early 20th century. So, I mean, at one level, I don't think that this is really an issue that I see that should be addressed for Savarkar. I mean, the Hindutva folks will point out that Gandhi also used similar language, and which is true, because these were normative practices, especially among lawyers who are writing to government officials. And so at one level, I think this is kind of a non-starter for many conversations.
Right.
Now, the issue of loyalty that Savarkar lays out in his letters is an interesting one, I think, and I think is worth kind of interrogating. But again, I think if we look immediately after he's released from the Andamans, he certainly is not loyal to the British, right? I mean, this is something that's worth kind of reminding. But I think one of the key things that often is forgotten when he writes his 1920 petition that is constantly referred to, especially in this most recent case by Rahul Gandhi, less than a year before he wrote this petition, he wrote a letter to his brother, his younger brother, in which he pointed out that his body weight had declined. He had been sick for almost 2 years. He weighed barely 95 pounds. And so he was quite ill. And in that letter, he says to his brother, he doesn't think he's going to survive the malarious and the kind of the horrid conditions of the Andamans. And I think this is often the context that's not remembered in these conversations. So I think that is an important context, that he is someone who is physically broken and ill at this point. And I think that's worth remembering as well, but that never gets discussed. as part of these conversations.
Right. Now, your book, there are, in the title itself, there are three very important words which actually form a very primary triangle as far as trying to understand or decode Savarkar is concerned: Hindutva, history, and violence. There's a constant interconnect, what you try to establish in your arguments through the book. I would first like to try to understand the connection which you are building between Hindutva and violence, where you argue that violence as civility, and his concept of Hindu civility, which contains that violence is at the center of one being a Hindu.
Yes.
That to be a good Hindu, you have to be violent, which is completely the polar opposite of what Gandhi preached.
Yes.
Practice also.
So, I mean, this is something that I thought was very, I mean, again, I think this is something that's very important to underscore when it comes to Savarkar. One of the key parts of his thought. And that's why I kind of wanted to emphasize Hindutva and violence as part of the title is that Savarkar argues that when we look at whether it's the movement of Aryans into the Indo-Gangetic plain, or it's the very aspect of being a Hindu, that violence is part of not only being a Hindu, but of being a human being, right? So for him, it's a larger kind of rethinking of the ways in which we understand human beings overall. He's very specifically wanting to counter the claims of the Buddha at one level and Gandhi at another level, that nonviolence is quite central to being, right? And so for him, it's rethinking these categories and really arguing that when we look historically, and also within the Hindu epics and within various literary traditions within the Hindu tradition, what you see is that violence is actually at the center of all kind of activities that he wants to emphasize. So for him, being a Hindu is in fact embracing one's capability and capacity for violence.
You actually write, that for Savarkar, the violence in the Ramayana, for instance, was very much part of the narrative, whereas for somebody like Gandhi, it was essentially a reflection of the inner contradictions of individuals to make out as to how the approach of violence was different from between the two of them. Now, you also write that for Savarkar, assassinations was part of Hindu civility. Now, that is where we actually come to the question that two assassinations which happened, if we can actually say somehow or the other inspired by the thinking of Savarkar. One was Madan Lal Dhingra in 1909 in London, and then Nathuram Godse in 1948. Now, to what extent, I'm not saying, that was Savarkar involved in the Gandhi assassination plot. That is not something which I'm asking. But trying to understand that this justification of assassinations as part of Hindu civil behavior, or rather Hindu civility.
Yes, and again, what Savarkar, regarding his understanding of Hindu Sabhyata, is really is saying that the very nature of Hindu civilization is actually about violence, and so he incorporates that category as something that he uses for writing his long histories. So his last book, his last major work, Saha Sonere Pane, or which is translated into the Six Glorious Epochs of Indian History, he traces moments of assassinations by Hindus against not only other Hindus, but others who are what he classifies as foreigners in India, as a legitimate form of political practice and violence, as a way of countering invasions, but also using assassinations as a way of targeting other Hindus who especially advocate nonviolence, right? So for him, the individuals who are putting forward a claim for nonviolence and arguing that Hindus are nonviolent, he says should suffer the greatest forms of cruelty, what he calls super savage cruelty, as a way of punishment, right? So it's not simply just assassinating someone who's advocating nonviolence, but actually having them suffer greatly in the act of their own death, right? So this is something that he actually puts forward as part of his history writing in his last work, and so that's where I sort of unpack those kind of arguments there.
For the last almost 4 decades now, right from the time that the Ayodhya agitation started becoming very popular, the word Hindutva has been a constant in Indian political discourse. But you argue in the book that Savarkar actually struggled to define what Hindutva was. So, what was really Hindutva in the mind of Savarkar? You, in fact, write Hindutva was history.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, and this is something that I struggled with in the when I was reading Savarkar, when I first started reading Savarkar, because on page 2 of his Essentials of Hindutva, published in 1923, he defines Hindutva, and to the best of my knowledge, that's the only definition he actually gives of Hindutva. He says Hindutva is not a word, but a history. It is not, he says, a spiritual history or a religious history. It is not a history that is analytical. It's not a history that's scientific. He says it's a history that is a history in full. And for me, this was something that's very perplexing, that in the almost 100 years since the book was published, many people have written about Savarkar, many people have written about Hindutva, but no one has actually tried to unpack the definition of the central architect of this concept and the idea of Hindu nationalism, that his definition of Hindutva is very specific, right? Which is, but at the same time, it's also very perplexing and confusing because as soon as he says it's a history in full, he also says that Hindutva is also not definable. It defies all analysis. So this is something that for me was very important to kind of really struggle and think with, that what is Savarkar really trying to say in his definition of Hindutva, right? So if Hindutva is a history, what kind of history is he talking about, right? It's not a history that's an academic history or disciplinary history that we are trained in thinking about, but it's a history in which he's talking about trying to capture the essence of the Hindu, trying to capture the essence of Hindu actors who were informed by the Bhagavad Gita, who were informed by various kind of civilizational practices that were quite important for kind of understanding the kind of challenges to outsiders who were coming into India. And he says that it's this history and of tracing these actors, of tracing the essence, which allows him to sort of think that what Hindus have been doing in terms of turning to violence has been a very long process that's lasted millennia rather than nonviolence, right? So it's really redefining the very meaning of Hindu, at the same time inserting a category of Hindutva, which again, he says defies all analysis, right? So there are these internal kind of tensions in his writings, but this practice of writing history at one level is to try to get as close to Hindutva as we can within the written word, right? And that's the argument that I make, that he's using these moments of writing histories as a way of trying to understand how the Hindu spirit has transferred from one individual to another over centuries, over millennia, to the point that it comes to him as sort of this kind of idealized figure of the Hindu who is now putting forward a certain kind of claim for, or reclaiming the Hindu as this violent actor.
Right. As a journalist who got interested in the politics of the Sangh Parivar from the 1980s onwards, when they really started becoming a major force, we were always, confronted with the word or the idea of Hindu Rashtra, trying to understand it through the works of various academics who wrote in the early 80s as well as later or subsequently. But we now see through your work, a new concept of the Hindu Samrajya. So that I found a new idea. Can you actually tell me something about the Samrajya, how this is distinct from the Hindu Rashtra?
I think, now, which part are you, I mean, can we just take a step back in terms of clarifying the question regarding the Samrajya?
I think in the book that you suggest that it's not the Rashtra. Rashtra is very much a part of vocabulary of Savarkar, but there's also the idea which comes up that something beyond the Rashtra or Samrajya.
Yes. So I guess the closest he does in terms of translating it within English, for example, would be thinking about the Hindu Empire, right? And thinking about the larger category of the relationship between the nation and the empire. And for me, what's really interesting is that these categories are both overlapping at one level. He argues in Essentials of Hindutva that the Hindu nation came into being through colonization, right? That the Hindu nation itself, the Hindu Rashtra, was formed in the very act of this process of colonization through violence and cultural imperialism. And so for me, it was very interesting that he is someone who's arguing for the creation of not only the Hindu nation, but also an empire and the whole process of colonization that was quite central for him for thinking about not only conquering this territory, which he says between the Indus and the seas, right, but also of thinking about a literal Mahabharat, a greater India, in which Hindus would travel all over the world and colonize other parts of the world to creating multiple Hindu states, multiple Hindu nations. And for me, this was quite interesting. I mean, it's not something that he fully develops. It's something that he also struggles with in conceptualizing a future after 1947. Thinking about creating what he calls a new Hindu-Buddhist empire that's going to be created with India, China, and East Asia. So this is much before Bandung. He's already conceptualizing sort of a Hindutva as part of a global phenomenon and an imperial phenomenon. So when individuals say that he was an anti-imperialist, I actually argue the opposite, that he's actually not an anti-imperialist. He's someone who is deeply committed to empire. It's just the fact that he's committed to the Hindu empire, but he's concerned about the Islamic empires and their persistence in India, he says, and he's concerned about European empires and quite celebrates the British Empire in many ways and sort of saying it's a magnificent world empire. The question is, how can Hindus participate in the future of building new empires and building new territories? And so he, even in Essentials of Hindutva, argues that this is a process that is global. Like Hindutva has the potential to be a global process and global phenomenon, right? So he's constantly moving. He talks about Rashtra, but he's constantly moving beyond Rashtra as part of his tactics and strategies throughout his writings, from the 1920s all the way to the 1960s, I would argue.
Right. Now, I know you are a historian, so you're more preoccupied or study the past, but we really also cannot ignore the contemporary world that we are living in. There's a thought which has come to my mind for a long time, that I possibly find that this particular government headed by Narendra Modi as a more Savarkarite government than that has actually ever been in India, even more so than the one which was headed by Atal Bihari Vajpayee. And this construct of Vishwa Guru, the idea of wanting to take out India beyond the geographical and the political spaces of India, has to some extent or the other inspired by the Savarkarite argument on the Hindu empire beyond the Hindu nation. Mr. Modi's engagements with the diaspora, whenever he goes out, addressing them primarily as the leader of the Hindu, not just as the Prime Minister of India. Would you, how do you react to this very nebulous construct of mind that somehow or the other, the idea of Vishwaguru, also the fact that just yesterday, a day or two before we are talking, the Sherpa of the G20 summit, which is going to take place in India, took the ambassadors of all the G20 nations to the Andaman Island, to the cellular jail, and spoke very evocatively about Savarkar. So is this also putting Savarkar on a national, at an international plane, along with taking the idea of the Hindu Rashtra internationally? Somehow the other. I know I'm a bit nebulous and confused,
Yes.
several questions looped into one.
Right.
But that's
No, I mean, I would agree with that assessment. I think that what we're seeing, and I've argued this for a while now, that what we're seeing is Savarkar, who's very for the Sangh Parivar has long been considered sort of the ghost father of the nation, is being resurrected. And I use the word resurrected purposefully because this is a term that Savarkar is constantly using in his writings. And it's a biblical reference that because he was an avid reader of the Bible, it constantly talked about the resurrection, not only of the Hindu empire, but resurrection of the Hindu spirit. And I think there are individuals in the Sangh Parivar who have understood this message quite clearly. And I think this is a longer term process of not only resurrecting Savarkar, but reclaiming Savarkar. And I've speculated that, he's going to be replacing Gandhi within a whole range of public spaces, right? And so in a way, by bringing the G20 ambassadors or even the efforts in Marseille, France, to build a statue of Savarkar in Marseille, France, where he tried to get political asylum and escape, that this is trying to internationalize Savarkar in a way to kind of popularize Savarkar, that what we're going to see is that eventually his place and presence and nationally will be, if the BJP remains in power, is going to spread and grow much further, right? So not simply names of streets and buildings, maybe even in currency notes replacing Gandhi. You're going to see a lot more of Savarkar part of the public sphere. And I think this is an effort to also create an understanding internationally, now that India has this kind of a position that Savarkar should not, when we do these kinds of things, it should not come as a surprise, right? And it's not surprising they take him to the Andamans, where as if he's the sole prisoner who was suffering. I mean, he wasn't the only individual in the Andamans, right? There were many individuals, but his place has now kind of served as a metaphor for all the political prisoners in the Andamans, right? And so it doesn't surprise me that this is happening. I mean, I think what we're going to see that this is going to continue it's going to proliferate, I think, much further. And you also see that, when within American Hindutva organizations as well, or British Hindutva organizations, of also wanting to reclaim Savarkar as well as part of, the global public sphere, if you want to think of it, but also the criticisms of academics who choose not to celebrate Savarkar in this way, or at the front lines in Australia, in Canada, in the United States, in the Great Britain as well, and in Germany, that you have these Hindutva organizations globally that are also now serving as kind of either monitors, surveillors, and critics of academics who are doing work that is not promoting Hindu history, right? So you have this global process that's happening, and this tension that's part of now, I think, sort of the global academy. But I don't think it's a surprise that this is a tactic, sort of the soft cultural tactic of the BJP in pushing forward Savarkar as the next person that they're going to, move forward with.
Yes, it's actually, leveraging the past in the present for India. There's also something which we need to understand, is that this wide appeal for Savarkar, which is there in India, which actually goes beyond the Sangh Parivar, even within political parties, it is actually quite easy to find political leaders who are generally speaking very supportive and appreciative and romanticize Savarkar. Now, where do you think that this is coming from?
I mean, I think this is coming from Savarkar himself. I mean, Savarkar, as I argue in the book, is the most prolific writer of his own life story in the first half of the 20th century. And I think up till Dhananjay Keer's biography of Savarkar that came out in 1950, I mean, Keer relied heavily on Savarkar, interviews with Savarkar, and also Savarkar's writings in order to write that book. So what we have is the codification of Savarkar's life in the way that Savarkar himself intended it to be, right? And it's become very difficult to break out of the kind of narratives that Savarkar created about himself as a brave figure, as Veer, right? So, I mean, in the book, I detail very carefully how the category of Veer was emerged and was attached to Savarkar, in large part was directly connected to his own writings, right? So in a way, when we think of Savarkar, the ways in which he's written about today is directly connected to that history as well, right? And there's also, I think, a colonial context in which the British banned his biographies, they banned his writings, and they banned his life to a certain extent. And I think that this is a moment where you have with the BJP in power, a moment where they feel like they're able to revive his life and resurrect his life moving forward, right? And I think the ultimate goal is really to replace Gandhi, I think, in the end.
Right. You keep talking about replacing Gandhi. There's also something which I read, which you commented to somebody asked you, that you talked about Savarkar's argument that India seems to be in a permanent civil war against the so-called foreigner, the constructed other. There is always, when we go around India, we find a huge amount of justification for the kind of vengeance which is perpetrated against members of the minority communities in India, especially the Muslims. Now, as we get into towards the end of our conversation, I would like to understand from you that understanding Savarkar, how his views, how the fondness, the affection for him has percolated down to contemporary India. Where exactly are you seeing that the state of this vengeance? Do you see that being perpetuated and continued for some more time?
Yes, I mean, I think Savarkar, by having, I mean, what's interesting is that the farther Savarkar went back historically in his writings, back to antiquity, back to Alexander the Great, was in fact to demonstrate that Hindus have always been in a position, in a circumstance of invaders and warfare since antiquity. So this is again coming back to the argument that the whole centrality of violence in the making of a Hindu. But at the same time, he laid out that as long as that there is the presence of a Muslim, the presence of a Christian, there is going to be the presence of a foreigner, right? So for him, the whole issue of the distinction which we were talking about earlier regarding violence and assassination, what he argues is that when a Hindu attacks a Muslim, for example, or a Hindu attacks a Christian, it is because of vengeance. It is not violence. So you'll hear many Hindutva folks say Hindus are non-violent. We don't actually perpetuate violence, even in the act of killing.
Unless we are provoked.
Yes. So even in the act of killing someone, Hindus remain non-violent, right? So it might seem as a contradiction, but when you insert the category of vengeance into there, that what the Hindu is doing is, and you'll see these histories, these arguments that Hindus have suffered historically. And so when a Hindu commits an act of violence, it's actually a form of vengeance, a vengeance of 1,000 years of suffering. So naturally, we are going to participate in this, right? And if you listen to the Hindutva folks today, one of the arguments they make is we are now in a new 1,000-year war, right?
Right.
And so what is laid out is that we are now in a new permanent war, right? I mean, Savarkar uses the category of perpetual war, that what Hindus have been in a perpetual war, and now by having learned this Hindu history, what we can do is now participate in a future of perpetual wars, right? A future of civil wars moving into the future. So there is no end to this cycle of violence, which is what I end the book with, right? That as long as you have this Hindu history, and because Savarkar says Hindutva is a history, that the history is directly connected to Hindutva, right? That any time history is mentioned, I always tell my students, for example, that anytime history is mentioned, substitute Hindutva in there. And what you begin to see is that that is what is really at stake, right? That without this Hindu history, Hindutva cannot exist. It becomes hollow. And so for that reason, it's very important to understand the dynamic of all of these, and that vengeance will continue as long as this history continues. And that's why they want to control writing this history.
Right. So what you are possibly saying is that there is far greater appreciation and understanding of Savarkar and his views now in 2022 and maybe in the next years to come than what used to be 60 years ago when Savarkar was living out the last years of his life.
I think his arguments have been revived. And I think his arguments, I mean, what's interesting is, I mean, I've argued that very few people read Savarkar. And Savarkar understood this, that very few people are probably reading his Essentials of Hindutva. But that didn't stop him from giving these lectures in which he recounted the narratives of his arguments publicly in speeches, which were then picked up by journalists and newspapers and then reproduced. So in a sense, these arguments were constantly a part of this of the story that were, whenever Savarkar spoke, that his arguments would be reproduced. And what we see today is that those arguments are reproduced over and over again through the idea that we need to control our history, right? So that's and I think it's not an accident that Savarkar says his only definition of Hindutva is that it is a history, right? So it's about this Hindu history that needs to be reproduced over and over again, right? So I think if we recognize that that is what Hindutva is, it's actually the recounting of this history is what allows this category of Hindutva to exist in the first instance, right? And I think that's why it's so important for them to kind of control this category of history, because it's actually what Hindutva is made of, right?
Right. You're talking about the control of history, and thank you, Professor Vinayak Chaturvedi. You talked about the control of history just a few days after the government's, the autonomous body, but very much linked to the government, the Indian Council of Historical Research, announced that they are going to compile a new compendium of about 12 to 14 volumes of Indian history, because what Mr. Modi also said at a subsequent day was that there has been a colonial conspiracy with the kind of history which has been presented. So India seems to be on the anvil of having a new history. And as you said, you tell your students that to replace it with Hindutva. Well, we will find more of Hindutva, more of Savarkar, and as you pointed out, that he is possibly going to even replace Gandhi. So these are fairly worrying thoughts, but that's it. That's the kind of world and India that we live in. Thank you very much, Professor Vinayak Chaturvedi, for having so lucidly explained the very complex world of Vinayak Damodar Savarkar to our viewers. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
Subscribe to the Federal's YouTube page for more interesting updates.